Welcome everyone to the panel. I hope we can try to make it very interesting for all of you. I will start off with my own small 5 cents just to give you a vision of how industry and urban designers and everybody else, also the policymakers, should go hand in hand because I believe, the vision. I'm going to talk about the vision of future mobility, but I think what is future? I think future is now because it's hard to design a future if you do not know what is coming up. So we will talk briefly about what do we see as future mobility. And when I say mobility, I always talk about inclusive mobility. I talk about mobility as a whole, so end-to-end mobility, and also taking into account all modes of mobility. Because, of course, while walking is important, it's also important for you to go from point A to point B with any mode of mobility that you choose. So going further, what is the future of mobility? If I have to say it a few words, we are already looking at or hearing, probably I'm sure many of you talk about electrification of vehicles. Many systems are coming up trying to focus on more use of cleaner energy in terms of less fossil fuel reliant. And this is not only applicable to bigger modes of mobility like cars, but also micro-mobility, because micro-mobility like smaller scooters, all those features of mobility are very important to be part of the city. When we also talk about making vehicles cleaner, we are also thinking about connected and autonomous mobility, where we are thinking about one way or another of reducing reliance on my car ownership. And how can I do that? By making cars independent or all modes of vehicle of transport independent, so they can drive by themselves more or less, so we have less reliance. And even think about other things such as mobility as a service, and not to get rid of the fact that we have to own something, a mode of mobility. Instead, we can be guaranteed mobility end to end and can have this as a service being offered to you. So as a small goal, we need to have mobility sustainable because this is important, future is important, reliable, safe. I already heard it in the previous discussion panel. Safety is very important. Autonomous is a goal for the industry these days. Net zero emissions and very efficient. So these are very important goals that we need to think about. What are future modes of transport? Think out of the box. Think very futuristic. This is just a depiction, an image from a very old magazine I used to see. When there you see all these futuristic designed vehicles, flying cars, flying policemen in a different way, but which we see is becoming more or less reality, where we have things like UAVs, so drones, in other words, flying around, hopefully flying people around, if not logistics. Flying floating trains. We are already talking about magnetically levitating trains. We are talking about flying taxis. We are talking about hyperloops, future subways. All of this is enabling you to have, cleaner modes of mobility, and also better modes of mobility, less reliance on cars, giving you your space back. And if you see a car being driven in a day, probably 80% of its time, more than 80% of its time, it stands still doing nothing, just waiting for us in a parking lot or in a garage. What if in an ideal scenario, my car drops me at my office and goes and takes somebody else and drops him or her off in their workplace or school place? So nobody owns a vehicle, but we share all these kinds of mobility modes. So what are the autonomous vehicles going to do? So basically, the vision here is have zero emissions with these vehicles. Why? How can we achieve that? Or at least try to have net zero emissions. So an autonomous vehicle is already capable of sensing its environment and moving safely around without human intervention or very little human intervention. We already see that we have achieved in all the degree of autonomy that we are quite advanced already in all the vehicles that we have these days. So we can say if we can fully autonomously drive and focus on our work, then we can provide more flexibility to people to share their modes of transport. By sharing, we are already producing less travel. By producing less travel, we are consuming, less and less fuel, even if you're focusing on fossil fuel and producing less emissions. Flying vehicles, UAVs, people might think it's a vision, it's a myth. We are already there. We were thinking about flying of these vehicles for carrying payloads such as cargo, parcel, DHL is already thinking about such systems. But even if you look into cities around the world, we are already doing and testing and deploying systems with human transport. Why this is important? If you say why we are focusing on that. We already saw in the previous presentation, and some of my dear friends here in the panel also in the previous panel said very wisely that we have to take our space back. So if you take space back from the ground, people have to go up. So when you go up means above 10 meters above the ground and below airspace, which is something like 300 meters. And then we can still use that space because that space is not utilized that much, very efficiently using cleaner modes of transport and flying safely around the world. So many cities around the world are already thinking about it. Why is it important here? To some of my architecture and urban planning colleagues, we need to think about the future now. We need to think about our building designs now. We need to incorporate these modes of mobility to be able to land, take off, deploy very safely. So all those infrastructural needs of a future city has to be thought of now. Then you can see even we can go from single mode use to such vehicles carrying something like buses, a flying minibus that can carry more than one particular mode of transport. And this is again not a myth. What I'm showing you are this is of course diagrams, but there are already prototypes available that we have been working with. And many big companies around the world work around these topics. Because this is the only way where we can reduce our reliance without affecting our quality of life, reduce our reliance on mobility, other modes of mobility that are not very efficient or not very clean or not very safe. Then hyperloops, many of you must have heard about them. So if we say, okay, how about traveling long distances very fast? Imagine if there is a hyperloop between the European continent and the American continent. You can be there in a matter of hours, faster than any jet plane or hypersonic plane available on Earth. And there are many prototypes already. If you see in China, for example, there are maglev trains that are already prototypes available that can ride more than 600 kilometers an hour very safely. These speeds can go up to even higher speed limits depending on the availability of the tracks, availability of the system and the infrastructure. So this has to be thought of. Otherwise, this would remain just as a concept. Futuristic subways, and why subways are important. Again, there was no space left on the ground, so either we go up or we go down. So once we talked about the space up, we have to talk about the space down. So subways are important with very advanced modes of mobility, not including the traditional trains or subway trains that we use, but other systems such as magnetically levitating trains within working offices, shared spaces for even people. Imagine people living in Tirana, working in a Greek city, or people living in another continent, part of Europe, traveling and working anywhere they want freely without having impact on their work life, without having impact on their social life. So mobility as a service is important also too, because this is one of the ways where we can implement all those ideas without having to invest in infrastructure. So we have invested enough. How can we optimize what we already have? What about my car? Can I sublease the car? Can I enable those systems, digital systems? So by digitizing the way we work around with those systems, to enable people to use the currently available resources or the assets that we have and optimize them into a very synchronized way to offer them to everyone around. So my bike is for everyone. My car is for everyone. My train, but of course I don't own the train, but if I'm the government, it's for everyone. So I can share all modes of mobility across the band and try to enable people to use based on the service level they subscribe to, just like your cell phone plans. This is a concept which has to be integrated within a city as a whole, so there are many stakeholders involved. We talk about logistics, we talk about consumer as we as consumers to go from point A to point B. We talk about mobility traffic control centers. We talk about other modes of transport. So it has to be intermodal. It has to be connected. It has to be talking to each other. It has to have a seamless connection with each other, so to share the relevant information that is required to enable such a system to work in a city. There are many cities around the world focusing on that, but I also saw in the previous presentation, which made me think, why not, how to make sure that the cars that were parking from day one. I saw the presentation from one of our colleagues here. We saw that the cars were stopped on the pedestrian walks. They were overspeeding, honking, taking a left turn, right turn. So cars were taking over, or other vehicles as well. How do we make sure that while the future is still not there, how can we make sure that we discourage them? One way is to put boulders, right, which is excellent, which is an excellent measure, but still people are smarter than that. So we have to somehow put and invest in other systems that are around the world as well, such as using smart cameras, LiDAR, radar, video cameras, that enable them to catch those violations, to discourage people in another way, rather than you trying to use a passive approach by putting boulders. You use an active approach. So if you do a mistake, you're going to pay for it. So when people are financially motivated or demotivated, then they would be forced to change their behavior and forced to have reduction in violations on the road, again giving back you your space, and if an offense is being made, can be automatically caught by those systems. So we have to think about also the future. And also think about the longer future when nobody has to drive. I don't think everybody would be willing to give up completely how to drive, but if a future that will be there, which will be fully autonomous, what will happen in the transition time? How can you catch all those people? Because when we are looking into a future of autonomous vehicles, you may ask me a question, which, because being of this panel, I'm going to ask this question to myself. Why do we need enforcement? Why do we need traffic lights? Why do we need zebra crossings? Why do we even need any lane markings or speed signs? Because we are all autonomous, and a self-driving car should know how to behave. Actually, it's not the self-driving car that is a problem. Actually, it's the human that is the big problem, the human driver. Because in the transition time, when we remove every human driving from the road, we still would need some sort of enforcement. So to make sure that people behave as they were supposed to behave. So because even if you see these systems, the cars completely clogging the parts of the road, it's even difficult for human drivers to even enforce systems based on just video feeds. The systems are becoming smarter, using deep learning, other AI-based solutions to identify problems in the network, using some cameras and try to come up with countermeasures. So, and this system is already in place in many parts of the world. And this is even useful for bigger vehicles like lorries than as compared to other smaller vehicles, because smaller vehicles still have a smaller black spot area as compared to lorries or bigger trucks that supply us goods that have more problems in terms of safety, especially when they interact with slow modes of mobility, when they interact with people on bikes, on foot, and other people around this slow mode. So thank you. I would thank you for the short. I will keep the presentation short. So I thank you for for your attention, and I will be more than happy to later on discuss during the panel some other details of this topic. So I'm going to go and I'm going to invite the next presenter, our dear Vice Minister. So can he please already have the floor, and either if you like to have the floor or while sitting, you can discuss your presentation, and then we'll go further with our discussion. Thank you.